All right. Well, I will go ahead and get us started. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Will Pfeffer. I am a senior program manager on the network team here at Code for America. I use he and him pronouns. I am calling in from Boston, Massachusetts, where it has suddenly become warm early fall again, which has been very nice the last couple of days. Um, a couple things to mention before we get started. As I think many of you know, we do have a code of conduct that applies to all Code for America spaces and events. Also, just to sort of set some expectations for how everyone behaves in the space. Try to make sure that you listen as much as you speak. Try to make sure that you are able to or you are conscious of centering voices that are less well represented, both in in our sort of industry, if that's what you want to call civic tech, and also just in the conversation, and try to be cognizant of making this a welcoming and positive space for everybody. I'm going to post a link to our code of conduct in the chat, which has some more specifics about that stuff. So I encourage everyone, if you have not had a chance to look at it in the past, to take a look at it. Also, a quick plug for an event on Wednesday. Our friends at Code for Pawnee, Indiana, are hosting a follow-up social event after their successful social events that they hosted after Brigade Congress. So that is Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. There is another Jeopardy game and a collaborative video chat jigsaw puzzle. So I'm going to post those two links in the chat right now, which everyone should be able to see. There's a meetup link to sign up for that social event on Wednesday, and thanks to Janet, the de facto captain of Code for Pawnee, and everyone else for making that happen. So tonight we are here for a slightly different kind of workshop than we've done in the past. We're doing a book talk. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Raymond Brescia, who is the Honorable Harold L. Tyler Chair in Law and Technology, as well as a professor of law at Albany Law School. Professor Brescia has been on the faculty at Albany Law for 13 years, prior to which she worked as a legal aid and tenants' rights lawyer in New York City. We are here tonight to talk about Professor Brescia's new book, The Future of Change: How Technology Shapes Social Revolutions. We will start with a talk from Professor Brescia, and then we'll move into Q&A. For Q&A, we can use the Q&A function on Zoom if you would like. You're also welcome to raise your hand, and I can allow you to speak audibly. And also, depending on how many people are logged onto the call, we may be able to just promote everyone to be a panelist so that we can all share our videos as we want to and have more of a conversation. But with that, Professor Brescia, how does technology shape social revolutions?
Oh, in so many ways. Thanks, Will. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining tonight. I too am on the East Coast, and it is just a beautiful night out, and it was a gorgeous, gorgeous day. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Code for America for hosting this, and for the Brigade Network for coming out. So the book is The Future of Change, and let me tell you a little bit about sort of where how it started and where it's going. So I am a law professor now, but before practicing law, before being a law professor, I practiced law. I started in the early 90s with the Legal Aid Society of New York as a tenants' rights lawyer and advocate and organizer, mostly in Harlem, so a little bit in Washington Heights, but primarily in communities of color in New York City. I did that work. I did it citywide eventually with an organization called the Urban Justice Center. And then I moved to academia. Right around that time, we saw the emergence of things like the Tea Party movement and the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. And, a lot of people were asking, well, does the technology, this was we had the emergence of social media and Twitter, does the technology create social change? And that's what some people were arguing, there were counter arguments and sort of all sort of spinning around like, yes, it does, no, it doesn't. I had an experience as an organizer, I had an experience working with social movements. And so, using the tools at my disposal as a academic, I started asking the question, well, what is the role of technology in social movements? And I didn't think it was fair to just simply ask, well, does it, did it, was it, has it, worked with groups like Occupy? Let's look back over American history to see, what role, if any, technology played in social movements. And in that research, really, I believe, unearthed a strong pattern that, in some of our moments of, great social change, they often followed the introduction of a new means of communication. And so it starts, I start with prehistory, with the United States, right, in the colonial era. And, in the colonial era, we had a new fangled form of communication, which was the printing press. Until about 1750, there were just a few printing presses in the colonies. But then around, the early 1760s, we saw them multiply, mostly in the coast, mostly in the cities, but we started to see them expand greatly. And, after the, what some people call the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, after that occurred and the British defeated the French, they imposed a tax on printers, right? And so that's, became the Stamp Act and became the Stamp Act crisis, which preceded the American Revolution by almost a decade. And it was in that moment that we sort of start to see the germ of a national view on the world. The colonies started thinking of themselves as a nation. The printers were really the source of that thinking, and yet the British in their wisdom said, let's tax the one network that can speak to everybody in the colonies, and let's see what happens. Well, what happens was it really radicalized the printers, and we get the emergence of people like Sam Adams and Ben Franklin, who were printers, who were activists, and they helped to form this sort of early revolutionary fervor. Imagine today if the federal government, in order to pay for COVID relief and economic intervention, taxed every form of communication, and what would that do, right? That would radicalize the media companies, and they would rise up against the tax, right? So that's essentially what happened. Now, fast forward a few years, right? So the printing press was critical to sort of forming this national identity. It also was critical to coordinating activities. And so when the Continental Congress met, right around the time of Lexington and Concord, and a year before the Declaration of Independence, they decided that they needed a free postal system. And so they created a postal system as one of their very first acts, so that they could communicate separate and apart from the British, the Crown postal system, because they were afraid that their letters were being opened, their dispatches were being reviewed, and they feared that they would be brought up on treason, charges of treason. So one of their very first acts was to create this independent network, this independent postal system. They called it the Constitutional Post, and it was very active in spreading word of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the battles of Bunker Hill, And again, it helped to sort of galvanize this national identity. And just a funny anecdote is, we often talk about, well, what are we celebrating on the 4th of July, right? 1776, 4th of July. Is that when the Declaration of Independence was read? Is that when the Declaration of Independence was, finalized? No. What we celebrate on the 4th of July is the day that the Continental Congress sent the Declaration of Independence to a printer, to John Dunlap, when they pressed send. That's what the 4th of July honors. So that's, sort of the first moment. But as you move on down American history, we see these cycles, these moments, what I call social innovation moments, where the introduction of new technology really sort of inspires people. It helps them to coordinate better. It helps them to think differently about the world. And so at each of the moments when a new means of communication is introduced, a social movement rises up, embraces the movement, sort of makes it its own, and uses it to advance social change. So what are some other examples? Well, we can move forward from the printing press to the postal system, right? So we talked about the postal system already, but the postal system in the United States in the early 19th century, so this is a very young nation, our postal system was the largest in the world in the early 19th century. There were 74 post offices for every 100,000 residents of the United States. Just imagine that in a sort of small town. I teach at Albany. Albany is about 100,000 people. We probably got 10 post offices. We would have 74. Right. So think about, where you live, the size of your city, and think about how many post offices you have. There's virtually a post office on every street corner. Right. So the postal system was so dynamic. It was so large that the post office workers, the workforce of the postal system was, twice the size of that of France, twice the size of that of England, 5 times the size of France. It was larger than the US military. Like, there were more postal workers than there were soldiers in the US, the armed forces. So the postal system was so dynamic, so important to knitting the new nation together. And it at the early 19th century, it's when we start to see some of the great social organizations that emerge in the United States at the time, that launched things like the Second Great Awakening and other temperance movements and things like that. What it also did was it helped to sort of plant the seeds for the abolitionist movement. But what the abolitionist movement grabbed onto was the next big advance in communication, which was the steam-powered printing press. So the printing press was manually operated until about 1830, when steam power was introduced to the printing mechanism, so that you could produce far more product, and far faster, far cheaper. And it prompted the Speaker of the House, John Winston Jones, who was a Virginia congressman, to say, the great revolutionizers of the world were going to bring about a slave revolt. And what the great revolutionizers of the world was he talking about? He was talking about steam-powered printing press and the postal system. Okay, so the abolitionist movement really embraced the new steam-powered printing press. It helped supercharge the abolitionist movement. Few years hence, about a decade later, the telegraph is introduced. Well, soon after the telegraph is introduced, the Seneca Falls Convention occurs, which is the often cited as the sort of beginning of the women's movement. Well, other women's conventions had been initiated prior to the Seneca Falls Convention. They just never got traction. But with the Seneca Falls Convention, what happened was news of it was spread through the telegraph. The AP had recently been created, and people started having copycat conventions, and the women's movement was born. So I'm going to sort of not do too much history. The book goes into some, all of this history, but I'm not going to get too much into it. I'm going to fast forward a little bit just to the civil rights movement. Now, between the telegraph and the civil rights movement, we got the telephone and the transcontinental railroad and the radio, and all of those are tied to the progressive era and the New Deal. But let's move forward to the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement was really savvy and really smart about using this new technology of the television. Perfect example of this was all the work done, in Selma and in Birmingham. In fact, the night of the confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a movie was being shown. I believe it was on NBC, Judgment at Nuremberg, which was a dramatic depiction of the trials of Nazi judges during the Holocaust, and trying them for their role in the Holocaust. And one of the main questions that Judgment at Nuremberg was trying to address was, what was the culpability of average Germans for Nazi atrocities? Well, in the middle of that broadcast, they break in with a breaking news alert of the attacks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So millions of people are watching Judgment at Nuremberg in their homes on a Sunday night, the Sunday night movie, and images from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, John Lewis, being beaten. These are, beamed into people's homes, millions of homes across the United States, and really helped galvanize support for the Voting Rights Act. Now, the civil rights movement and the television really grew up kind of together. When the television was first introduced, it was sort of seen as a kind of base medium. I mean, think of how people sometimes think about Twitter and Facebook now. But television was like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, Punch and Judy, comedians and Howdy Doody, right? And so the television networks were trying to strengthen their own gravitas and try and prove that they were, a legitimate medium. And so, they did things like they did a documentary. I think it was ABC that did a documentary called Sit-In. And again, John Lewis is portrayed in the Sit-In documentary. And they went, they videotaped the people being trained, members of different civil rights groups being trained on how to confront, how to respond nonviolently to attacks that they were going to get if they were going to sit in at a lunch counter. And so they followed these activists around. Well, so that was done by the television network as a way to sort of show that TV could depict important issues. Well, the civil rights movement then took that documentary and used it as a training video. So we see the television and the civil rights movement are really sort of intertwined in their advocacy. Now, begs the question, so do these technologies, do they cause social change to happen? Well, no, they don't, because what was also happening with all of these movements was two other things. And this I go into in the book. And I'll get to some contemporary examples in a moment. But the what I sort of talk about in the book is the sort of three components of successful social movements, social justice movements that have emerged in these social innovation moments. They certainly utilize the latest technology available to them, but they then do two other things particularly well. One, they create grassroots networks, often in a sort of a franchise model or a federated model, if you would, where there's a local chapter where people can meet face to face, and then that's connected to regional, state-based, and national organizations, right? Think about how the post office is organized. Well, that's one of the ways that the groups were formed. They were often formed around the postal system. That, you know, if a new post office emerged in, you know, the frontier, then a new chapter of these national organizations would form, because people would move to the new location where there was the post office. People would, you know, communicate with the folks back home, send us the information so we can start a new chapter. So we see these networks forming as the post office expands in the United States, and the organization of these movements mimics the postal system, right? So that's really important. That network, that idea of a grassroots network that has these local nodes where people can engage in face-to-face communications and you know, build local trust. So that's part two. So you've got the medium, the technology, the network, but then the last thing is the message. And the message has often been one that was that stressed shared humanity, shared destiny, that was geared towards lowering inequality in some form, whether it was gender inequality, racial inequality, political inequality, that the groups that formed through the civil rights movement had these three components. They embraced the latest technology. They developed into a network model with, you know, what I call a translocal, and researchers call a translocal model, which is, you know, a local node that's connected to a bigger network. And then finally, they embrace this positive, affirming message that stressed what the late Derek Bell called interest convergence, ways that people that are potentially unlikely allies have a shared goal and have shared interests. And he used as an example of this the decision in Brown v. Board of Education as uniting the advocates, the civil rights advocates, with white elites who were concerned about the American standing in the world. Why was the American standing in the world in question? Is it because print images from television were being beamed throughout the world, and the Soviet Union, locked in a Cold War with the United States, particularly in in nations that were that were primarily people of color, they were using these images to say, you know, look how the United States treats its people of color. And so the white elites were concerned that those images were harming American standing in the world, and they were. And the interests of the civil rights movement and the white elites came together in this way to promote greater racial justice through decisions like Brown v. Board of Education. Okay, so that's the history. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what changed after the civil rights movement. And because a new technology comes on the scene again, and the groups that emerge in the wake of the civil rights movement, think the environmental movement, gay rights movement, the sort of new women's movement, they say, you know, we want what the civil rights movement was able to achieve, but they latch on to a new technology. And the new technology is the ability to engage in computerized mailing lists, to generate computerized mailing lists. What this does is it breaks that chain. It breaks down that network organization with the translocal chapters connected to a larger organization. It goes from a network to a hub and spokes. And so individuals have direct contact to a center or a central organization, what sometimes, is referred to as bodiless heads, right? And people, they're members, but they don't engage in any activism. They don't engage in that face-to-face trust building exercise of being a part of a local organization. And so that, for the next 40 years, we get that connection broken, right? Where it's no longer this network, and now it's hub and spoke. And, I don't think coincidentally, we also at the same exact time, we see a dramatic increase in income inequality. The income inequality that continues to this day starts in the mid 70s, right after we see the break in community organizing. We see the reduction in the number of people who are in unions, and this sort of breakdown of these traditional, if you would, organizing structures. Now, something changes again, in the 2000s. We get the internet, we get social media, and just a little bit more, and then I'll get to your questions. In the book, I talk about how contemporary organizations have used and are using social media and other tools, digital tools today to advance social change, but they're doing it in a way that gets back to those three things: the medium, network, and message. And so the examples I provide and go into in the book include the West Virginia teachers strike from a couple of years ago, and how they harness social media to create a grassroots movement. The effort to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, which was a national movement, but it was a network of people. They used that sort of they used language to expand VAWA to reach more people. They reached out to unlikely allies to bring people into the fold where their interests converged around reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. I talk about the marriage equality movement, particularly an effort in 2012 to get a ballot referendum, to pass a ballot referendum in Maine, and how they really built a face-to-face organizing network in Maine to support that ballot referendum. And then lastly, I focus on the work of Unite HERE in Long Beach, California, where they advanced a minimum wage ordinance for hotel workers. And the campaign that they did there, bringing together unlikely allies like homeowners associations, small business owners, right? If anyone is opposed to raising the minimum wage, it's small business owners. But what the union did was they went to the small business owners and they said, look, our union members live and work in Long Beach. If we get more money in the members' pockets, they're going to spend money locally. They're going to spend money in your stores, right? In your grocery stores, everywhere, in your restaurants. And they got the small business owners on board. This was a minimum wage that affected only hotels, right? But still, the small business owners, you would imagine they would say, well, we're next, right? But they did it. Homeowners associations, not usually a group that you imagine is going to support a minimum wage, but they said, you know what, we want our community to thrive. And if if more workers have more money in their pocket and they're spending it locally, that's going to support local businesses. So I go into these stories in the book. I try and sort of show how technology has worked in the past, how it's being used in the present. I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of, have probably more stories than I have right now of your own experiences. But I think it's a really exciting time. I mean, there's so much work to do. I do think, we can't let technology be the end of the advocacy, but it can be a tool. And I know that's what Code for America really pushes and promotes, the idea that technology is a means to an end, and that's a more just society. It's not an end in itself. So it's not the book is not a love letter to technology. It's more of a guide to how people have used technology in the past and how people have been using it in the contemporary era to promote positive, progressive social change. Now, there are a lot of downsides to technology, and we can get into that in the Q&A. But I do think that there, I try to offer in the book examples of people who have in the past harnessed technology in positive ways, and then now in the contemporary era doing it as well. There's a lot of work to be done. The Biden election, means that we're going to be focusing on, certain things more than others if Trump had been reelected. But that means that there still is a lot of work to do. Now, let me just as an aside note, before we get into the Q&A, one of the things that I work on personally in my research and in my service work is using technology to promote access to justice. And I know that that's something that Code for America works on as well. We've done things like creating a website for people to get information on how to defend themselves against foreclosure actions. We've worked on, how nonprofit groups can understand the limits imposed by federal law on lobbying, nonprofit lobbying. So if people, during the Q&A want to talk about some of those initiatives as well, I'd be happy to do so. But I'm also, of course, this is about the book talk. So let's talk about the book, but we can also leave some time or weave in a conversation about legal tech as well.
Great. Well, thank you. So looking at the number of people that we have, I think I'm gonna just promote everybody to be a panelist so we can have a little bit more natural of a conversation. Before I do so, I just want to note that we are recording this this session, so we certainly encourage everyone to share their video and speak up and join the conversation. But if you're not comfortable with that, with yourself being recorded, then you're also welcome to leave your video off and just participate through the chat. Also, just give another quick reminder of the code of conduct, since we'll be participating a little bit more fluidly. While I do all the clicking required to promote everyone to a panelist, Aaron has asked a question in the chat here. Aaron's question is, why do the organizers of social movements need to use the latest technology? In other words, what happens that makes older technologies become less effective as tools to enable social movements?
I think it's a great question. I think that to the extent that there are older technologies that might help people achieve their goals, there's certainly nothing wrong with doing that. And we certainly see, people using the mails. I mean, look at recently the get out the vote efforts where people were writing postcards, handwriting postcards and using the mails. And just as an aside, I mean, I think some of the most heartwarming things I've seen over this last weekend were images of, postal workers and USPS trucks driving by and everyone cheering. I mean, I just like, how awesome is that, right? But so you certainly can use older technologies, but I think that something happens with, as we get, new technologies come on the scene, and, necessity is the mother of invention, and organizations looking to advance social change reach out for whatever tools may be available to them to make their jobs easier. And to the extent that a technology may make someone's work easier, that's great. But we also, the new technology has, think about what everyone says about, the internet and social media. It's going to be a global community. There's something about new technology over the years where it kind of inspires people to maybe think a little differently, and to see that maybe these are harbingers of change. And I'm going to quote Emma Coe, who was a very early women's movement leader in the 1850s. And she said, I'm going to quote here, that a new era was dawning that was heralded by 1,000 harbingers, including the lightning coursing the telegraph wires, as well as the smoke-girt steeds rushing along our iron-rimmed ruts, meaning trains. They were but embassies of a power whose will yet place freedom upon something more than a theoretical basis and give equality of privileges a being as well as a name. So I think that, when we see this all around us today, people sort of saying, how the internet is connecting everybody, for good and for ill. But I do think there's something happens with a new technology, both, groups saying, we need to, use this technology if it's going to help us. But they also, groups are shaped by the technology, but they also shape it. I mean, think about the high school students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. I mean, their social media advocacy is as good as it gets. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her advocacy on social media, as good as it gets. So, the new advocates coming on the scene seem to be able to sort of shape the technology and its use in new and interesting ways. So I don't think that a social movement is entirely dependent on new technology. You can always, sort of go backwards and use older technologies. And in fact, what I advocate for and what many groups, I urge people to consider doing is get back to that face-to-face. I mean, that most primitive form of communication, face-to-face communication, but also leverage technology to the extent it helps you advance your cause. So I think, groups do both.
As you're speaking here, I think that it is sort of easy to think about this as like, well, it's all just communication, and like technology makes communication faster. But you also sort of get it like this network effect that kind of amplifies the power. That it's not just about the communication, but it's something bigger than that. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that aspect of it.
Well, I think, I spend a bit of time in the book talking not only about network effects, but also about social capital. And, social capital is formed best in face-to-face groups, in face-to-face communications and encounters. And it through that developing of that social capital, you develop trust and you develop the willingness to collaborate and to cooperate. And that's best created and formed in those face-to-face organizations. Now, you certainly can find ways to build social capital online, but I don't think it's the same. I think that it's, whether it's, Tahrir Square in Egypt, or, Occupy, or, the Women's March in the United States, you might connect online for sure, right? But then you come into the streets and you develop relationships and you develop trust and you develop that muscle memory for cooperation. And yeah, I mean, communication is central to all of that, and tech can amplify that and make it easier, but you still need to have that, that face-to-face, that trust that that leads to cooperation, and that cooperation leads to activism, and that activism then brings about change. So I mean, communication is at the heart of a lot of it, but it's really about building that trust.
That makes a lot of sense. So I will invite anybody who would like to jump in. I will raise a question from the chat here. What technologies today do you think have yet to meet their potential to have a big impact on social change? For example, what might be on the horizon? And the person gives Stack Exchange as a model for having a constructive, accessible, and open discourse on problem solving.
Yeah, I think that there, some with transparency in government, blockchain, I think is something that could be used to greater effect. I think VR and AR, I think, could be really interesting to help people, build empathy towards others. If we can sort of show, what life might be like for somebody else, live in somebody else's shoes for a little bit. So I think that those are, obviously, I mean, the big change that has happened in the last 8 months has been Zoom, right? Video conferencing has just exploded, for better or worse. But I think in a lot of ways, it's been a revelation to be able to do something like this much more easily than we could have before. And I think that it is also probably changing the workplace forever. The ability to do video conferencing. So I think that there are, some technologies. I think that for sure, I'm seeing groups, rent strike groups and tenant advocacy groups really learning more than they ever have before from other communities, right? Housing is such a local thing. I mean, it's as local as it gets, right? Housing advocacy is often in a bit of a silo geographically, that organizations tend to focus on, their block, their neighborhood, maybe citywide. I mean, in New York City, there are very few citywide tenant advocacy organizations made up of tenants. There are advocacy groups, but there are very few tenant-driven organizations where they can share information across neighborhoods, across buildings. That's historically been the case. We're seeing now, advocates in New York learning from advocates in Oakland and Philadelphia and Chicago. So there's much more cross-pollination because people are more comfortable with Zoom and other forms of communication to share some of their learnings and to share ideas and strategies and tactics. So I think that we're seeing that more and more.
I want to leave a moment here for other folks who want to join in. We've heard a lot of my voice and love to hear others.
And a lot of mine too. I'm sure you all have opinions about this stuff.
This is an excellent narrative, Mike. I just wanted to ask you to go back to the 70s change in technology when we went from, just clarify, a more personal networking to the hub and spoke. And that was driven by computerized mailing lists? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
the ability to engage in direct mail, generated by a computer database of mailing addresses. So I go into in the book, in the early 60s, the only way to find out about political donors to Congress was literally to go to Congress, and there were index cards that had every individual who made a political donation to any member of Congress. And people would go there, try and find out, okay, who's given to this person in the past? How, can I get them to give to that person in the future? And then, it was ultimately put on, on a mainframe. That, one of those first political databases was put on a mainframe, and then everyone started to use that model. Wow. And it really broke that, certainly unions existed, although they diminished greatly. And there were still some groups like the Welfare Rights Organization, the WRO. There were some groups that were still engaging in that kind of more traditional organizing, but a lot of the groups that formed at that time started, doing, really replicating the direct mail model, where they were, highly professionalized coastal cities. Those were their bases. The NAACP at the height of the civil rights movement had 1,000 local chapters. The American Legion, which I go into in the book, I talk about the effort to pass the GI Bill. The American Legion in the 1940s had 12,000 local chapters spread out throughout the United States. I mean, the American Legion still exists, but a mobilizing organization today, it's inconceivable that you would have an organization today with 1,000 chapters, let alone 12,000 chapters. Now, we're starting to see this, what I call sort of a franchise model. We're starting to see, Moms Demand Action, right? Local groups that are, part of a larger network forming, but they're forming at the bottom of the pyramid and connecting to a larger network using that sort of franchise model, and doing the face-to-face work. But a group I talk about, an anecdote I provide in the book is, Common Cause, which still exists today. But Common Cause was a good government group that was formed in the late 60s, early 70s. And they were one of these hub and spoke kind of organizations. And, they had members reach out to the leadership and say, hey, we don't know any other members who are in our community. We would love to meet with other members of Common Cause so we can maybe, get involved in things together. And the leadership of Common Cause didn't even know what to do. And they said, well, okay, you can hold a watch party where you could watch one of our leaders who's going to be on, Meet the Press Sunday morning, right? So sit in a room and watch information beamed into you on the television, as opposed to try and create a local chapter. So, a lot of groups that really sort of gain momentum and gain strength in the late 60s, primarily early 70s, they followed this hub and spoke model. Now, I don't know how many folks were able to watch Mrs. America, which was this, mini series, if you would, on Hulu. I really encourage everyone to watch it. It's fantastic. But I was so excited in it because it goes over the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment and how the women's movement faced the Stop ERA movement, which was led by Phyllis Schlafly. Well, Phyllis Schlafly had power because she had a really big mailing list. And the mailing list is practically a character in the show. It's so fantastic. And at the end, she downloads it to a floppy disk and she gives it to the Reagan campaign. But that's what they were built on, these computerized mailing lists. And that was Phyllis Schlafly's power, the ability to get the women engaged and conservative women to mobilize them against the Stop ERA. I mean, excuse me, to mobilize to stop the ERA through the Stop ERA movement.
I have a question. This is Aaron again. You mentioned that sort of like the social media and those things are sort of allowing people to move back as organizers to that more federated model. Are there considerations when adopting those type of technologies that are like corporate proprietary technologies versus like open source, or things that are sort of more aligned with the federated model themselves as a technology that would be good to keep in mind? And I'm thinking like the comparison between like network television and the post office, right? Like, are there analogs and things that we can learn from the past where like a proprietary technology maybe had limitations that caused social movement to sputter? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, there's certainly a whole raft of problems that comes from using these, commercial technologies, right? And, we saw with the Cambridge Analytica scandal that the line between private and governmental is very thin, right? And so, and we don't need to look any farther than Hong Kong to see where, monitoring of social media and other places around the world is, very dangerous for activists. We haven't gotten there yet, thank God. But I think that if someone were able to develop, and I know that there, some other, signal and telegraph, there are other ways of communicating that may have a little better encryption. Certainly Facebook groups from, across the political spectrum seems to be the engine for a lot of organizing. It's how Moms Demand Action got started. It's how the West Virginia teachers got started. It's also how, a lot of alt-right groups got started. I mean, the group of individuals who wanted to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Whitmer, like that was a Facebook group that started. So there are certainly dangers on all of this. And I think that the, privacy is really critical. To the extent that we could create better network sites that allow people to engage, with greater privacy, I think that would be wonderful. That's beyond my power. But it is, the ability to communicate, which is interesting. What that moment, that hub and spoke moment, really replicated television, right? When I was growing up, in the 70s, there were like 5 television channels, right? Maybe 6. Now, I mean, thousands, right? Thousands of media channels, thousands of ways to get entertainment and to get information. What we see now also with organizing is it doesn't have to be a hub and spoke. It's a lattice, right? Where everyone can communicate with everybody at the same time. And the ability, if you've got a good idea, whether it's a meme or a slogan or something, you can get it out there and you can communicate to everybody in your network at one time. And then that can, build strength. We're no longer dependent on, whether it's a, captain of industry or the head of an organization to say, what the answer is. And this is something that, the groups that organized around VAWA did, is that they, they said, on social media, use the hashtag #RealVAWA and tell the world what a Strengthen Violence Against Women Act would do for you. Think about the Me Too movement, right? Like that, the ability to communicate your experiences and your ideas, to connect with other people in a super powerful way, to bear witness and to connect, is really, really powerful. And we're not, we're no longer dependent on the gatekeepers, which is is both good and bad. There's upsides to that for sure. There are also downsides. I don't know if I answered your question, Aaron. I went in a couple different directions.
There's a question here in the chat that is related that I think you have mostly covered, but just to be sure, because it does cite a specific author. Peter asks, what are your thoughts on the intersection between some of these new technologies and surveillance capitalism, as explained by Zuboff?
Yeah, Shoshana Zuboff's book is great and terrifying, and I do think we have not quite. We saw a little bit in Oregon in the protests in Oregon, in the summer, where there was a little bit of formal government surveillance of journalists and organizers. We haven't quite sort of crossed that Rubicon in the United States, which many other countries are experiencing now, thankfully. So I think that there's still a thin line, very thin line, between the Facebook and other social media entities and the government. And those lines have not been crossed that much yet, but it's a risk. It's a risk. And we also see, Zuboff goes into, with surveillance capitalism is this idea that we are the product, right? If you're getting a service for free, we are the product. Our information is being harvested, it's being sold, and that is for sure. And with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, if folks are familiar with that, it's one of these, silly personality quizzes on Facebook where I think 300,000 people took this personality quiz on Facebook. A researcher got their results, started to take this information from these people. But when you clicked on agree to participate in this quiz, this so-called personality quiz, you not only consented to give the researcher all of your information, you also agreed to give the researcher all of your friends' information. And so it ended up allowing, and it's not a breach, it was consistent with the Facebook terms of service. People clicked on it, but the breach resulted in this researcher getting access to 87 million people's private Facebook pages. And then that information was used by Cambridge Analytica, and then it was used by the Trump campaign in 2016 to help them target, specific people based on their, the personality types that they had identified as being receptive to certain messages to get them to support the support the Trump campaign. We also certainly have seen, and this is well documented in the bipartisan Senate report, of efforts at fake groups to discourage people, primarily African Americans, from voting in the 2016 election. We saw some of that this year, but I think that people were more prepared for it and more savvy about it. But the Russian media sources were targeting primarily African Americans to discourage them from voting for Hillary Clinton, or to vote, encouraging them to vote third party. So we've certainly seen that thin line be broke between government and surveillance capitalism being broken, in campaigns. We haven't quite seen it yet, at least to my knowledge, in the United States, where the government is getting access to that information. If you want to see what that's like, go to China. I mean, China has, they're monitoring everything. They have this trust index where you get, basically a credit score for everything you do. Hostile posts, you fail to pay a bill, you jaywalk, it's all getting fed into this trust index. And it's not just affecting you, it's also affecting your network and your friends, and making it harder for people to get loans, to get jobs. Thankfully, we're not there, and God willing, we're never going to get there. But yeah, no, Zubov's book is great and a wonderful and important read.
Let's go to Susan and Mike.
Thanks, Ray.
You're welcome.
Ray, just a brief comment on that. It's possible for local police departments to subscribe to the Twitter API for zip code organized tweets. So this can happen at a local scale as well as a national scale.
Oh, absolutely. And law enforcement is certainly, looking at public portions of Facebook pages. Sometimes they're getting into private portions as well if they get a warrant. So yeah, no, that certainly public posting is being surveilled for sure.
Susan, you were waiting patiently with a question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I'm curious what your thoughts are. My name is Susan Cotter, and I live in Portland, Oregon, where the police are really part of the problem and the city really isn't responsive. So there's a pretty significant social media effort, where services are provided to BIPOC because no one else will, with regard to, safety and eviction and medical health and mental health and all kinds of things. And I'm curious if you have an opinion. It's almost like they're replacing the city and not in the same way as community-based organizations are.
Well, two
Often,
things.
you know.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. So two things. I think we're seeing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you concluded your question, Susan.
Go right ahead. I'm anxious to hear your.
Oh,
as
okay.
long as you understand, I'm happy.
Okay, I think so. So we're definitely seeing technology-aided mutual aid societies emerging. It's a wonderful development, and technology is certainly helping match, people's needs to what's available. But to take a step back to talk about the, Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, technology has absolutely made that movement as important as it is, has raised the profile of that movement to the extent that every American knows about the issue now. Does anybody think that we've seen a dramatic rise in the shootings of African American men and women by the police over the last 5 years? I don't think so. But now it's just being recorded on video, and that's what's making the difference. Is that you can think of case after case where if this incident any incident 20 years ago, you would have heard how the victim was resisting arrest and was crazed with crack or whatever. I was in the Bronx in the 1980s. Like, these stories were fairly common, but now they're being recorded, and the just by citizen journalists standing on the street corner. I think that the young woman who recorded the George Floyd shooting, I think I saw that she won some journalist award, but that's what the technology is making that possible, is that now these interactions are being recorded, and it's galvanized people, not unlike in the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, that was photographed and on the network news. But now we don't need the network news to get this information out. So I think in those two areas, Susan, in response to the the failures of government for communities of color, we're seeing technology highlighting some of the problems, but also serving to provide support, and those are the mutual aid societies that are emerging.
But I am curious whether it just is it seems like it's making the divide between what the government provides even bigger, because they have to provide it for themselves. But I guess what I'm saying is a lot of times a lot of these movements have been trying to change the system, whether it's laws or change the system, and it's almost like they have to create their own system because that system is failing them, and they're creating it through the social media. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, it's a bad thing. I'm just curious whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether that's a danger or not.
Certainly communities don't have the resources to respond to all community needs, right? And we're supposed to have a social safety net. We're supposed to have Social Security and other forms of economic support. But to the extent that those systems are failing certain communities, you have to the extent you can, you have to try to provide service to satisfy human needs, while advocating for a better, more robust government response. So it's a failing of our government if the government isn't providing a strong social safety net that is needed. And people are, I think, responding to a certain extent, to the extent that they are able, but we need a more responsive government. And I fear that there's going to be, lots of calls for austerity in the new Congress. to make it more difficult for the Biden administration to deliver relief where it's desperately needed. So I think that, you know, there are services that I'm a right-sized government person, right? Like we need government to provide the services that people can't provide on their own. And if they're not providing it, you know, if government is not providing it, oftentimes communities do step in, but that doesn't absolve the government of its responsibilities.
If that's not on brand for Code for America, I don't know what is. Micah, you had a question. Do you want to ask that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and hopefully this comes out. It's just been sitting here for a second, so I don't know if it'll come out exactly as it was going to come out when.
Come out however it's going to come out. It's totally fine.
Cool. But yeah, I guess just kind of generally speaking, like we've been talking a lot about like a lot of problems in like big cities and like really dense areas, I think, but I think kind of globally and then like from a rural perspective, there's still like billions of people on the planet that don't have internet or aren't actively on social media or like using this kind of like new form of technology. I think one of the things that really differentiates kind of the era that we're in versus like the era of television or radio or mail even is that like the post office or networks didn't really own like communication shares in quite the same way, or they didn't really own social capital. Like I think like Google and like the Facebooks and the Instagrams of the world, actually, I'm kind of willing to like put it out in my head that they like own social capital, at least to some extent, or they own how social capital is distributed, just kind of based on how they deploy their platforms. So kind of given that, if you're like willing to buy into that, which you may or may not be willing to, but given that, like, do you think that in especially rural areas where internet use is like scarce or not available, does like this kind of new era of technology transplant like in a one-to-one or like in a direct ratio to how they might already have systems of advocacy kind of mapped out in their communities? And then how does that play out as like, you know, the Elon Musks of the world tried to distribute global broadband internet to everyone on the planet? And is that going to play out in like a positive way or a negative way? Will it be like an enabling factor for these communities? Or do you like, what's kind of your take on that, I guess?
Well, I think it, as a good law professor, I would say, and a good lawyer, I would say it depends. It depends on how it's used. And certainly, you know, we've seen some, you know, I totally agree. The digital divide is still a huge issue. You know, we do need, you know, a national broadband plan, you know, for particularly for rural communities, like, you know, like the New Deal did for rural electrification. Because so much now, you know, I heard an advertisement. I live in a suburb of New York City, and I heard an advertisement or a PSA the other day about, you know, if you're having trouble with your food stamps, know that there's no, you know, we're not doing in-person meetings, but you can log on, you know, using your smartphone, and you can, you know, resolve most issues. Like, what are you talking about, right? So I mean, I think that the digital divide is becoming narrowed. It is becoming, you know, access to the internet is, you know, a critical service that people need. I think that, you know, are we going to start seeing that, you know, social media becomes a utility? I don't know. But, you know, we more and more, especially, you know, today, look at all of us, you know, we're on this, you know, this platform. You know, it is the future. And so to the extent that technology is for the few, it's only going to exacerbate economic inequality, for sure. Are there dangers to expanding that access to the internet and mobile platforms? Sure, there are absolutely surveillance questions, you know, questions of algorithms and serving some communities better than others, certainly. But I think the drive towards greater access is a net positive.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
There's another question in the chat here that I can read unless anybody wants to ask one out loud. This is from Carlos. Carlos gives a little bit of context here. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen federal hearings on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. We've seen a lawsuit against Google, and today the incoming presidential administration called for a task force focusing on the connection between online threats and stalking and real world consequences like extremism and violence. The proponents of free speech, like the EFF, for example, and quite a few journalists are against what they would see as censorship. On the other side, you have groups who see the harms. You pointed out Hong Kong. There was also Facebook's lack of action to stop genocide in Myanmar. What role does the private sector have, the social media companies themselves? What role does government have to step in and hold these companies accountable for real physical harms done to people, where online extremism leads to real life violence?
Well, I think we all have a role to play in that, and Section 230 is going to be modified. I think, so Section 230, for people who don't know, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act eliminates liability for internet platforms and sites that, if some harm comes to somebody because somebody else posts something on that platform. I think we're going to see that reined in. I think you started to see some, modest efforts at, tagging information about the election, misinformation about the election, some posts being taken down, violent posts, incitements to violence being taken down. But they're going to have to reform themselves, or they're going to be reformed, and you will see, if more states pass legislation like California has that has some elements similar to the GDPR in Europe, you're going to see tech companies calling for a federal privacy law that will negate essentially states, preempt states from issuing their own laws. So it will be a fairly watered down privacy bill that will ensure that states can't pass anything stronger than what the federal government passes. So because they're very powerful. I mean, look what Uber was able to do in California just this last week with the proposition on independent contract workers. They're very powerful in Congress. I think that there will be some changes. It's interesting. Talk about interest convergence, right? You've got people concerned about radicalization online. And then you've got conservatives concerned about conservative voices being silenced. So oddly, those groups are converging to, maybe strengthen protections to create some liability. And that's the best way to get the social media companies in particular to care about content moderation, is make them liable. And that's in 230 now eliminates that liability. So I think that we're going to see 230 being reined in a little bit, maybe.
I think that Section 230 is probably the most well-known section people just refer to by a number currently, at least in the kind of media that I consume and the kind of people that I hang out with.
Yeah.
Do other folks have questions? We're running a little short on time, but we have time for one or two more.
Or people can go have dinner.
Right, or you can go have dinner. Well, if we don't have any questions, Professor Brescia, you have, like any good academic, you have another new book coming out soon. You have a book coming out in the spring about lawyering in crisis situations. Do you want to give us a couple words about what that work is about?
Sure. I didn't write that whole thing. It's an edited volume of lawyers who we're involved in crisis situations. We've got the lawyers who litigate against the Trump travel ban. We've got lawyers who defended individuals on Guantanamo Bay. We've got the lawyer who, working for the Department of Justice, wrote the Ferguson report. So it's a lot of first-person accounts that people are interested in, sort of how to work with lawyers. I think it's a terrific read, even though it's written all by lawyers.
Well, we will certainly look forward to that. So thank you all for joining, and thank you for the lively conversation. This was really fun. Next month, we are having another one of these. We're doing another book talk to finish out the year. On December 7th, we'll be talking with Sid Harrell, who is a big name in civic tech. We'll be talking with her about her book, A Civic Technologist's Practice Guide. I will post a link in the chat to that. And just a reminder, on Wednesday, we're having the sort of social event with Code for Pawnee, the Jeopardy game and puzzle. We did that after Brigade Congress, and it was a genuinely good time. So I just posted the link to those two, and I hope to see you all there. But thanks for coming, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Have a good night.